What are the biggest missed opportunities for building wealth that most people don't know about? Story 1. When I got my first job out of college, I thought I'd treat myself to a new car. Not just any car, a shiny red sedan that made me feel like I'd made it. The monthly payments were brutal, but I told myself it was worth it. Fast forward 3 years, I was still broke, the car was worth half what I paid, and a bird pooped on it every single day. Meanwhile, my coworker, who drove a beat-up old Civic with duct-taped mirrors, had just bought his second rental property. I asked him how he could afford it, and he said, "Simple. I don't buy stuff that craps value." I sold the car, bought a used beater, and started funneling the extra cash into savings. Now I laugh every time I see someone leasing a luxury car while sweating over their credit card bill. Turns out duct tape is a solid wealth strategy. Story 2. I used to think being a millionaire meant you never had to worry about money. Then I met a guy in San Francisco who told me, "Yeah, I'm a millionaire, but so is my neighbor's cat." He wasn't kidding. He explained that between the cost of housing, taxes, and avocado toast, his words not mine, $1 million in that city just meant you could breathe without a bank loan. It was a reality check. I realized it's not about hitting an arbitrary number, but how far your money goes. I stopped focusing on millionaire status and started investing with a focus on freedom, mainly the freedom to eat toast without taking out a mortgage. Story 3. My uncle once told me, the easiest way to get rich is to marry rich. So naturally, I married a guy named Rich. Turns out Rich had a ton of credit card debt and thought saving was something you did on Black Friday. We spent the first 2 years of our marriage digging out of financial hell, but on the bright side, it forced me to get serious about money. I learned how to budget, started investing, and even managed to max out my Roth IRA. Rich is still working on his credit score, but hey, at least he's handsome. Moral of the story? Always ask about the other kind of rich before tying the knot. Story 4. In my 20s, I was convinced I'd strike it big with crypto. I spent hours researching altcoins, throwing money at anything that promised 10,000% returns. I even had a spreadsheet titled Future Lambo Fund. Then came the crash of 2018. My portfolio was worth less than my car insurance payment, and I still had to explain to my mom why I couldn't chip in for groceries. If I'd just put that money into an index fund, I'd have a nice chunk of change by now. Instead, all I have is a lesson. If it sounds too good to be true, it's probably the digital version of Monopoly money. Story 5. When I started my first job, my boss told me, "Make sure you sign up for the 401k." I nodded politely, then spent the next 3 years completely ignoring that advice. I figured I needed the money now more than I'd need it when I'm old. Then one day, a coworker explained that the company match was basically free money. I did the math and realized I'd missed out on about $9,000 because I was too lazy to check a box. I signed up that day, but not before going home and yelling at my reflection in the mirror. Lesson learned: never leave free money on the table, even if it comes with boring paperwork. Story 6. Back when I was in my early 20s, I made the mistake of thinking that financial success was about striking it big with one brilliant move. My plan? Stocks and crypto. I threw nearly every spare dollar I had into risky investments, always chasing the next hot tip. I had this naive belief that if I just hit the jackpot once, I'd be set for life. It felt like everyone on the internet was getting rich overnight except me, so I doubled down. But then, reality hit. The crypto crash of 2018 wiped out nearly half of what I had put in, and I had nothing in savings to fall back on. Looking back, I wish I'd done something as simple as setting up an auto investment into an S&P 500 index fund. Had I just parked my money there and let time and compounding work their magic, I'd be far better off today. It took years to dig myself out of that financial hole, and what stings the most is how unnecessary it all was. Financial security isn't about gambling on high-risk, high-reward schemes. It's about consistency and discipline. Story 7. When I was in high school, my history teacher gave us this mind-blowing example of compounding interest. If you save $100 a month starting at 20, by the time you're 60, you'll have over $1 million. At the time, I thought it was neat but didn't take it seriously. Fast forward to my first job out of college, and all I could think about was finally enjoying life with my paycheck. I bought new clothes, leased a car, and took trips that I financed with a credit card. Retirement was this far-off concept that I figured I'd worry about later. It wasn't until I hit 35, buried in debt, that I realized I'd wasted years where my money could have been growing. My co-worker, a quiet guy who never seemed to splurge on anything, casually mentioned his 401k had hit 6 figures. That shook me. I went home that night, calculated how much I'd lost by not starting in my 20s, and nearly cried. It felt like a life sentence, but I started anyway, maxing out my 401k contributions and living lean. I'll never make up for those lost years, but at least I know I'm building something for the future. Story 8. I remember the first time I heard someone compare 1,000,000 seconds to 1,000,000,000 seconds. 1,000,000 seconds is about 11 days. 1,000,000,000 seconds is 31 years. That analogy stuck with me, and yet it still didn't really hit me until I started working in tech and saw firsthand the wealth disparity between my colleagues. One guy, mid-30s, would always talk about his family fund. I thought he was joking until he explained that his grandfather had invested in real estate back in the 1950s and passed down properties to the next generation. Meanwhile, my family's legacy was debt, medical bills, student loans, and credit cards. That conversation lit a fire under me. I realized that wealth isn't just about what you earn, it's about what you leave behind. I've since made it my mission to break that cycle for my kids. I started buying rental properties one at a time and setting up accounts for my children. I may never be a billionaire, but I hope one day they'll look back and realize that I tried to be the ancestor who set things in motion. Story 9. I grew up thinking millionaires were these mythical beings who lived in mansions and never worked a day in their lives. It wasn't until I was in my late 20s at a company happy hour when a coworker casually mentioned that he and his wife were on track to hit $1 million by 40. He wasn't flashy, just a regular guy who brown-bagged his lunch and drove a beat-up sedan. When I asked how, he said, "We just live on half our income." That stuck with me. I went home, did the math, and realized that my wife and I, both with decent incomes, could be saving so much more if we cut back on the unnecessary stuff: streaming subscriptions, dining out, the latest gadgets. Over the next year, we made changes, downsized our apartment, started cooking at home, and maxed out our 401ks. It wasn't easy, but now, 4 years later, we're closing in on $500K in net worth. The biggest lesson I've learned? You don't need to win the lottery to build wealth. You just need to get out of your own way. Story 10. My biggest regret is not taking advantage of employer retirement matches earlier. When I got my first real job, they offered a 401k match up to 6%. I ignored it, thinking, I'll do it later when I'm making more. I didn't understand that I was basically leaving free money on the table. A coworker once explained it to me like this: imagine your boss offers you a $3,000 bonus every year and you say, "Nah, I'm good." That's what you're doing by not maxing out your match. By the time I wised up, I'd been at the company for 6 years. I did the math and realized I'd missed out on almost $20,000 in free contributions, not even counting the growth from compounding. Now I tell everyone who will listen, get that match from day one. It's the easiest money you'll ever make, and it adds up faster than you'd think. Story 11. When I was younger, I thought the idea of being a millionaire was reserved for tech geniuses, Wall Street traders, or people born into wealth. I never considered it something within my reach. I had a decent-paying job, but I spent money as fast as I earned it. New clothes, nights out, upgrading my car every couple of years, it all felt normal. I justified it by saying I was living life while I was young. But then I hit my late 20s, and something shifted. I stumbled across a blog about personal finance, and for the first time, I read about compounding interest in a way that actually made sense. The author broke it down with an example. If you invest $200 a month starting at age 22, and it grows at an average of 7%, you'll have over $500,000 by age 60. If you wait until 32 to start, you'll have less than half that amount. It floored me. $200 was less than what I spent on eating out every month. That same day, I went home, signed up for my company's 401k, and maxed out the employer match. I also opened a Roth IRA and started putting every extra penny I could into low-cost index funds. It wasn't easy at first. Cutting back on expenses felt like a sacrifice. I downgraded my car, canceled subscriptions, and started bringing my lunch to work. My friends didn't get it. They called me cheap and joked that I was acting like I had kids to support. But I stuck with it, and over time I got used to living on less. The best part? Once I automated my savings, I didn't even think about it anymore. Now I'm 38, and my net worth recently crossed the $400,000 mark. It's not millionaire status yet, but it's so much more than I ever imagined having at this age. What blows my mind is that the money is doing most of the work for me now. Thanks to compounding, my investments are growing faster than I can add to them. Looking back, I wish I'd started even earlier, but I'm grateful I woke up when I did. The truth is, building wealth isn't about making huge sacrifices. It's about making small, consistent choices and giving them time to pay off. Story 12. When I was younger, I had no idea how much my health would tie into my financial future. I used to brush off regular exercise and healthy eating, thinking I could just deal with problems later. Then in my early 30s, I got hit with a wake-up call, a surprise medical bill for a condition that could have been prevented with a healthier lifestyle. It wasn't even the cost of the treatment that stung the most. It was the realization of how this would snowball into my future. Higher insurance premiums, more frequent doctor visits, and even lost wages because I had to take time off work. From that point on, I started making changes, not just for my body, but for my wallet. I learned to cook healthy meals at home, joined a gym, and prioritized sleep and stress management. The financial savings have been incredible. I'm healthier now, and as a bonus, I spend way less on eating out and impulse purchases because my mindset has shifted. If there's one lesson I wish I could pass on to every young person, it's this: your health is your most valuable investment. Take care of it, and it will pay dividends for life. Story 13. I used to think retirement was something you didn't need to worry about until your 50s. It wasn't that I was careless with money. I just figured I had time. My first job out of college offered a 401k with a 4% match, but I didn't sign up. I had student loans to pay off and a long list of things I wanted to buy. I told myself I'd get around to saving later, when I was making more. Fast forward 5 years, and I was making more, but I was also spending more. I bought a new car, moved into a nicer apartment, and took expensive vacations. I felt successful, but I was living paycheck to paycheck without even realizing it. One day, a coworker showed me his retirement account balance. He was the same age as me, but he had over $100,000 saved up. I thought it was impossible until he explained how he'd been maxing out his 401k since day one, taking full advantage of the employer match. The worst part? I realized that I'd left thousands of dollars in free money on the table by not contributing. I felt like such an idiot. That night, I sat down and calculated how much I'd missed out on. It was sobering. If I'd started saving at 22, I could have had over $50,000 by then, even with just the match and modest growth. That was the wake-up call I needed. I immediately set up contributions to my 401k, maxing out the match, and I opened a Roth IRA to make up for lost time. I also started tracking my spending and cutting back wherever I could. No more impulse shopping or overpriced coffee runs. Instead, I funneled every extra dollar into investments. Over the next few years, I watched my balance grow, and for the first time, I felt like I had control over my financial future. I'm 35 now, and while I'll never get back those lost years, I'm on track to hit $500,000 by 50 if I stay consistent. The biggest lesson I've learned? Start early. Even if it's just a little, the time you give your money to grow is worth more than anything else. Don't wait for later, because later sneaks up on you faster than you think. Story 14. One of the best decisions I ever made wasn't glamorous, but it changed everything. I stopped buying new cars. In my early 20s, I leased a brand new sedan because I wanted to look successful. The monthly payments were brutal, and I was stuck in this cycle of upgrading to another lease every 3 years. By the time I hit 30, I realized I'd spent over $50,000 on cars that had no long-term value. It was absurd. So I made a drastic change. I bought a used car outright for $8,000 and decided to drive it until it fell apart. Without that monthly payment, I started putting the extra cash into savings and eventually into investments. The difference was night and day. By the time I was 35, I had enough saved for a down payment on a house, and now, in my 40s, I have 2 rental properties and a solid retirement fund. It's funny. None of my friends remember what car I drove back then, but they sure notice the financial freedom I have now. Story 15. Luck played a massive role in where I am financially, and I'll never forget how it came into my life. My dad, who never made much money himself, spent years caring for his eccentric great-aunt. She was notoriously difficult, hoarder-level crazy, but he stuck it out. When she passed away, she left her house to my sister and me. It was a total wreck, condemned by the city, but the land it sat on was valuable. We sold it, and after splitting the proceeds, I had enough to pay off my student loans and still have some left over to invest. That one stroke of luck changed everything. Without those loans weighing me down, I was able to save aggressively and even buy a house by the time I was 28. I often think about how different my life would be if she hadn't left us that property. It wasn't something I earned, but I've done everything I can to make the most of it. Now, whenever people ask how I've managed to get ahead financially, I always emphasize the role of luck, because while hard work matters, sometimes it's the opportunities you don't see coming that make the biggest difference. Story 16. I'll always remember my great-aunt as one of the most difficult people I've ever known. She was a hoarder, stubborn as a mule, and didn't have a kind word for anyone. My dad was the only family member who put up with her, visiting her every week and helping her with errands. As a teenager, I thought he was crazy for putting in so much effort. She never seemed grateful, and the rest of the family kept their distance. When her house was condemned, my dad helped her move into a retirement home, and my sister and I ended up working there part-time as servers while we were in high school. We'd see her occasionally at dinner, but she was still her grumpy, manipulative self. When she passed away a few years later, none of us expected what came next. She left most of her estate to my dad, but surprised everyone by leaving her house to my sister and me. It was a total wreck, condemned and filled with junk, but the land it sat on was worth a fortune. We sold it for the land value alone and walked away with enough to pay off our student loans and still have money left over. I used my share to invest, buying a small condo that I rented out while living with roommates to save even more. That one act of luck changed my entire trajectory. Without student loans hanging over my head, I was able to save aggressively and invest early. By the time I hit 30, I had enough to buy a house, and now in my late 30s, I'm looking at a comfortable retirement ahead. The funny thing is, I never thought of myself as lucky growing up. My family didn't have much, and everything felt like a struggle. But looking back, I see how much of my financial success came from that one unexpected break. It's taught me to appreciate opportunities, even the ones that come wrapped in grumpy old lady packaging. Story 17. I used to think that becoming wealthy was about earning more, so I jumped at every opportunity to increase my income. But no matter how much more I made, I always felt broke. The turning point came when I read a post online about non-consumption. The idea was simple. It's not just about what you earn, it's about what you don't spend. That hit me like a brick. I went through my expenses and realized I was bleeding money on things I didn't even care about. Streaming services I never used, fancy clothes I didn't need, and constant dining out. I decided to do an experiment. I'd try living on 50% of my income and invest the rest. It wasn't easy at first, but I got creative, cooking at home, buying secondhand, and even taking public transit instead of driving. Over time, it became second nature, and I started to see my savings grow. Now, a few years later, I have enough investments to feel financially secure. The craziest part? I don't even miss the things I gave up. If anything, I feel freer. Non-consumption isn't deprivation, it's liberation. Story 18. I grew up in a family where no one talked about money. By the time I hit 25, I didn't even know what a 401k was. At my first full-time job, HR handed me a packet about retirement plans, and I just shoved it in a drawer. It wasn't until years later, when a coworker explained employer matching, that I realized how much I'd been missing out on. I'd worked at that company for 3 years, and they offered a 5% match, which means I'd basically thrown away thousands of dollars of free money. I felt sick when I did the math. That's when I decided to educate myself. I devoured books, podcasts, and subreddits about personal finance. I maxed out my 401k, started a Roth IRA, and automated my investments. Now, in my mid-30s, I finally feel like I'm on the right track, but I can't help but wonder how much further ahead I'd be if I'd started sooner. If I could give my younger self one piece of advice, it'd be this: learn about money as early as you can. It's the foundation for everything else in life.